Now folks, recently a commenter named Forearms McGee pointed me to a recent small minor parties debate which was held in Wellington a few weeks back, and he thought Leighton Baker stood out. Now, as many of you know, I struggle with Leighton a bit, so I went and had a look at that debate, and I found myself agreeing with much of what he said. Now, for the purposes of this video, I've focused entirely on Leighton's responses to the host's questions, and I would like to hear your feedback in respect to Leighton's answers. Now, I've posted a link to the entire debate, which is on MD Rangi's channel, in the description below.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 2020 Minor Party Debate here in Wellington City. We've got 3 of the 4 candidates that said they'd be here this evening, and it's my pleasure to welcome at my extreme right, your left, is Ben Wiley van Eerd, who's the candidate Hutt South for the Opportunities Party. Awesome. Next to Ben is Sue Gray, who's New Zealand Outlaw Party co-leader and candidate for Nelson. And to my left, Leighton Baker, party leader for New Conservative and candidate for Waimakariri. So one of the first questions is in relation to COVID-19, or COVID-20 as we are now, and with all of the data that's come out since lockdown was imposed, what mandatory measures in response to an outbreak would you now see as reasonable?
There you go. I can start. It's really interesting with this whole COVID issue. We are a small island nation, and if we'd been locked down straight away, we wouldn't have had any of it come in. We wouldn't have had the lockdown that's destroyed businesses. We wouldn't have had that $100 billion worth of debt that our children and grandchildren are going to have to pay for. Because the government didn't act fast, they didn't act rapidly, and when they did act, it was pathetic. They didn't even secure the borders. So they imported COVID and destroyed our economy. That's the baseline of it. In reality, what we see now is COVID is an influenza flu that will go through the population. We're controlling it here in New Zealand, but if we're allowed to go through, most of us will recover and actually carry on. So for me personally, it's not about locking us up. It's about really good hygiene practices. It's about looking after the vulnerable, that's the elderly and those with pre-existing conditions, but allowing our businesses and lives and schools and communities to continue. Because destroying our economy is something that actually we have no control over. It's foolish. It's poor economics. If we locked the borders, we could have all lived our lives and we wouldn't have lost anything other than our tourism industry. As it is, we can't even get true stats of the suicide rate of what's happened during this lockdown. And if we stopped all traffic driving on the roads, we could say, I saved your life, no road accidents. If we said no one can play sport, I'd say, I saved you, we've had no sporting accidents. No one went to work, I've saved you, no one had a work accident. But in reality, we have to live, and we have to thrive in this nation. And so, no to lockdowns, yes to good hygiene, and yes to us actually living our lives, and no to a massive debt that's been thrown on our children.
We'll shift gear a little bit. So this is a fairly provocative question. How will your party fight the rising influence of China in New Zealand?
There's actually a few bits to that question. One thing that we actually have to do is diversify in regards to who we're trading with. Because so much of our trade is locked in with the Communist Party or the CCP of China that we're actually too afraid now to actually call them out when they do anything that's wrong. So when they've treated the Uyghur people in the north of China and incarcerated them for re-education, we're too scared to say anything. When they're taking over the South China Seas and grabbing land that they actually have no right to, we're too scared to say anything. When they're influencing in the Pacific Islands and taking some of the island rights of them, we're too scared to say anything because we're indebted to them in the amount of trade. The trouble is we're exporting really good quality food and essentials, timber, water, etc. And we're importing luxury items that we don't necessarily need with all the packaging. And then we have to get rid of the packaging, and who owns waste management? The same people that are sending it here. So we're tied to a nation because we haven't diversified our trade. So we're saying one thing we must do, diversify to other nations. So more trade with the UK, with the USA, with Canada, with Australia. Look at the trade with other developing nations, so Pakistan and India, to actually, like we produce enough food for 40 million people, and it's some of the best food in the world. We're talking nations with 1 billion people, they can take our food. So we've got great stuff we export, diversify our trade, and then we can actually stand up and actually say what we really think in regards to human rights and individual rights. And the second part of it is, I totally agree, in the Constitution. And the Constitution needs to be based around the Magna Carta and the human rights, so that all our laws come back and say, are we looking after people? Because at the end of the day, it's the people we want to cherish in New Zealand, isn't it? It's the people that are important. And that's one thing as a party we're saying, make people important again in New Zealand. And I do believe the Constitution will be a great way to do that.
So on the back of that question, for those who think that we need a written constitution, which I think all three of our speakers are indicating, to what extent should the Treaty of Waitangi be included in the constitution? And if so, what version of the treaty?
Ooh, that's a good question. You might as well come to me first, and these guys can deal with the fallout. I think with the treaty, there's a couple of different parts to it. One part is the justice issue, and the justice issue is where Māori had land stolen off them or taken off them corruptly, and so that's a justice issue that must be dealt with in that area. The thing of co-governance, I don't think should be part of it, and the reason is we are all part of New Zealand, and a constitution should look after us all equally. As soon as we start pulling out any people group for special treatment, I believe then all of a sudden we've opened the door to racism, which we don't want. So I believe the constitution should be fair to all people, it should be have input by all people in New Zealand into the constitution, but it shouldn't specify any particular race or gender over anybody else in regards to a formal constitution for New Zealand. I do believe that we need to be under one law for us to go forward. I don't believe we can have different rules for different people. I don't think that works in any nation.
But once we have a constitution, are you willing to step away from the United Nations and World Health Organization, and I presume by virtue of that World Trade Organization, and giving the falsified information, given the world on vaccination starters? So I guess the question is, what are your respective parties' positions in relation to World Health Organization regarding, in comparison to what we might call national sovereignty? Widen the question to include such things as the Paris Accord, Kyoto Protocols, UN Migration Pact, basically anything that's coming from an external place of United Nations or so forth. What would be?
I've only got an hour and a half, so sorry guys, it's the end of it. Hey look, back in 1919 the League of Nations was formed after the First World War. The idea was the leaders of the nations would come together and discuss things so we'd avoid a Second World War. The United States helped form it, but they never signed into it, and that made it very weak. And what happened then is Japan and Italy and Germany left the League of Nations. We had the Second World War. After the Second World War, the League of Nations folded, and the United Nations started in 1947. The same idea that if we can get the leaders talking, we can avoid global conflict. And to be realistic, we haven't had a World War III, so that's a good thing. Unfortunately, the United Nations have moved away from its core role and now believes that it should be dictating other nations what they should do, which is not right. And so we must retain our sovereignty. We must be allowed to choose what we do. I would prefer the United Nations went back to its core role, which is leaders discussing to avoid future conflict. In regards to things like the Migration Compact, we shouldn't sign up to something unless we had an idea what it was. The big thing there is the government never even told us they were signing up to this international agreement. That is wrong. The government are not New Zealand. They're a tiny, tiny portion that are there to represent us, not all over us. And they've got it wrong. They think they're there to rule, they've forgotten they're there to represent. And when they sign international agreements without even talking to the people they're meant to represent about it, that's corruption. Okay? In regards to the Paris Accord and the ETS, these things are actually really hurting us economically. and making zero difference to the world's environment. That's poor governance. If we want to change the world environment, we need to look at what we can personally do to change it. And so we believe actually invest in research and development, target specific pollutions, whether it be how our soils can work better with more soil health and less nitrates, whether it's something that we can put in the water that acts as a pumice to soak up nitrates, whatever it is, target the pollution, come up with a solution and export the solution. That's the way that we can influence the world. In reality, China are building something like 50 coal-fired power stations every year. 50. What are we kidding ourselves? We're destroying our economy, putting massive debt and restrictions on our productive sector, particularly farming. So farmers now are struggling to make a living because of all the extra regulation on them. That doesn't actually help us as a nation. It's poor governance. We actually want to look after New Zealand and lead by example by coming up with proper solutions. I think the Kyoto problem, for instance, 10 years ago we were all told we're going to be drowning by now, and it hasn't happened. Okay? It hasn't happened, so if we continue to believe what they told us then, when it never happened, we're the foolish ones. We need to say, look after New Zealand, do what we can here to affect the world positively, but not destroy our economy while we're doing it, because that's just poor governance.
Sure. Okay, there are two referenda questions coming up for voting in this election, if we get one. Sorry, this is my little sneaky side comment. One is euthanasia, and the second is the legalisation of recreational cannabis.
Yes.
What are each of your party's views on those two referenda questions?
So I'm on the opposite side. I've worked with young people for 6.5 years. Deputy leaders worked with street kids in South Auckland for 15 years. Another lady on our board has had 400 of SIP's most at-risk youth through her house. And all of us have seen incredible damage done by cannabis to young people. And legalising something that causes that much harm is not wise, because all that young people hear when you legalise it, doesn't matter what rules you put around it, doesn't matter what barriers you put, all they hear is this is okay. And that will destroy young people. And I disagree that all the evidence does not say it's good. The evidence in Colorado is the opposite. It's increased use, increased harm, increased road accidents, increased mental illness, increased suicides. And so I don't believe legalising is good for New Zealand. We have alcohol, which is legalised and regulated and still causes billions of dollars worth of harm each year. Legalising this, I believe, will cause more harm, and it's a sacrifice of our young people for big business. Just like the medicinal, if we legalise it, big business will come in, they'll take ownership of it, they'll make millions of dollars off misery of New Zealand people, and I don't think that's good governance. So I'm in the no camp, personally. The being is the question is not do you want cannabis legalised? The question is do you want this legislation passed into law in New Zealand? So even if we vote no, the government can still put it in because they just changed the legislation. Yeah, so my problem with legalising euthanasia, all of a sudden we've devalued life and it will be abused. I mean, that's just the reality. And I'll give you two classic examples. One is what's happened in Belgium, where it started with 4 people asking for it every month, it's up to 40, and now the youngest person to apply for euthanasia is 11 years old. Because good law is really clear and easy to define, but this law brings in the word unless. And as soon as you bring the word unless into a law, people will continue to challenge it to open it up for more and more use. So if we legalise it, we will see elderly people coerced into euthanasia by their greedy siblings. We will see people with disabilities coerced into euthanasia because their families say it's so hard to look after them. Some of them will choose to do it because they believe it's hard to look after them. But what does that say about us as a nation when instead of looking after the sick and the vulnerable, we decide to terminate them? I believe, I understand it, I've seen people suffer terribly and I've had family die from cancer. But I honestly believe if we open the door to this law, we will see innocent people die, and I don't want us to be a nation that just kills people instead of looking after them.
Yeah.
Anyway, given the discussion regarding United Nations and external forces on New Zealand's sovereignty, how do we, in 2020 and beyond, create legislative framework, particularly so in an MMP environment where we have 65, elected MPs, plus 4 or 6 Māori seats, and then the rest are all basically list candidates. How do we actually form good legislation in that framework moving forward? Maybe you'd like to add some more to what you were saying.
So the question is about
the legislative framework. How do we make moving forward under an MMP system, or should we keep an MMP system, or what's TOP's position on that? How best to make legislation moving forward?
All right, I'm not quite understanding the question.
Do you want me to go? Yeah, and then you can think about it.
Great.
Yeah. And I'm not going to answer it, so. And we do have a few ideas around this. One is binding citizen-initiated referendum. So the CIR bill was brought in 1992. The government said we don't need to make it binding because no government ignored the will of the people. No government's ever honoured a citizen-initiated referendum. That is not democracy. But our way of binding referenda, it would have to get 2/3 support of the vote. So it's not a 49-51 like we saw Brexit. It's a very, very clear mandate from the people. We believe make it easy to get. So if we want to get one, 5% of the people that voted last time, not 10% of the voting population. And so the binding, a very clear question, yes or no, and then it had to get 67% support to change the law. So for instance, to change from what we have now to legalising euthanasia, there'd have to be overwhelming support of New Zealanders for that change in who we are as a nation, okay? Which I think is a good safeguard for it. In regards to what we do, I think STV, a single transferable vote, would be better, but with our system now, I would like to see the number of MPs reduced, and we could do that by saying if you're an opposition list MP, you don't go to Parliament, because they have the least amount of responsibility within Parliament. The leader of like any particular party, so for instance, we had the Outdoors Party get 10% and had 12 MPs, but they were all opposition list. Sue would still go in as the leader, still have 12% of the vote, but the other MPs wouldn't. We'd also like to see fixed to 3 terms. You can only go in for 3 terms. We believe that would get rid of people that are going to Parliament just to be politicians. And would actually just incentivise people to get some work skills, some life skills before they go to Parliament, and actually bring some aged wisdom into Parliament for us, and also do away with all the lifelong perks. So no extra superannuation, no lifetime travel. So when you go into Parliament, you go there to serve the people. There's not an incentive, it's not a financial incentive, it's not a I'm on the pig's back incentive, it's I'm getting in there, I'm serving the people, then I'm leaving. I've got the skills to do it. So we believe that would bring a culture shift. And the last thing, we'd love to tie MPs' wages to the average wage. They don't have to be the same, but linked to it. So their wages only go up if the average wage goes up. And therefore, if the country's doing well, they get rewarded, and if it doesn't, they don't. And we just think instead of having a higher salaries commission, because MP salaries have gone up about 3 times more than teacher salaries, and that's not fair. So do away with the high salaries commission, link it to the average wage, not the minimum wage, because I know what would happen then, especially with the Labour government, the average wage, and that would solve some issues. So there you go.
So you touched on 1080. What's the Outlaws Party position regarding the current use and increased use of 1080 over, for example, the last 12 months?
I should probably be sitting between these two, really. New Conservative have said we need to start looking at replacing 1080. So we have had a lot of people approach us and say we can trap and use lures and actually do a better job than 1080 if we're given a 10-year contract. Because what happens with trapping and lures, it takes a little bit more money and time for the first few years to get the numbers down, but once the numbers are down, your labour rate reduces in that area and you're into maintenance. So on a long-term plan, they can do it with traps and lures. Now, I'm not a hunter. I go hunting, but I'm useless, all right? I always go back to New World on the way and get a steak on the way home, okay? But I enjoy going out in the bush looking for animals, and they're quite safe. But the reality is we've got some people in New Zealand that are fantastic, and they really understand. They understand the animals, where they hide, where they'll be, why they don't necessarily come up to trap lines. And those people, we need to capture that knowledge. We need to have them training other young people to actually, it's an industry, it's employment. We can actually use the animals, there's a whole lot we can do. There may be some remote areas that we still need to use poisons, and I don't know, but I reckon we need to phase out 1080 by increasing the money that we spend on training and getting young people involved in trapping, and at least, what we don't do at the moment, we're not actually giving contracts out to the trappers and the lures to actually compete against. They're not allowed to compete. So the people that control 1080 do some of their trapping themselves, Like down where the Takahe Reserve, there's no 1080 allowed anywhere near there. It's all done by trapping. So in Wellington wants to become the world's very first predator-free capital. There's no 1080 unless you've seen any. I haven't seen any dropped over Wellington. It's all done by trapping. So traps do work. We need to start it near population bases and spread it out and actually develop an industry there. Like you say, we can use. Apparently, it's only polar bears and possums that have a waterproof fibre like that. Amazing. So I don't know if I'm that keen on possum back steaks, but hey, whatever. The hobby's hard. Yes. Cool. So that's our policy. Look at replacing 1080 by introducing a whole new industry of trapping and litter projects.
Okay, I'd like to take us in a slightly different direction now to talk about each of your policies, please, on justice in New Zealand and identifying areas where the current government is not doing well and what policies your party would have to address the issues of justice and incarcerations.
Want to start?
Okay, Richard, it's not you start.
Cool. Justice is a massive issue for all of us. And what I don't think that this government has done well, since we're allowed to be a little bit critical, just a little bit, they haven't done much well really when it comes to justice. But the first thing they haven't done is they haven't identified the causation. So what is a common denominator with people that are incarcerated? And they haven't identified it. I think Bill English started to identify it. But the common denominator for people that are incarcerated is actually broken relations and broken families. It's young people coming from fatherless homes. That is a common denominator with virtually every single person incarcerated. So if it is the common denominator, that's where we have to start with the justice system. We have to start with actually training people how to build, develop and maintain healthy relationships. Because if people can do that better, we're going to have less people falling off the other end. We'll have less marriage breakups, we'll have less child abuse, we'll have less mental health issues and less suicides and less crime. Because people are in a solid family with good, strong structures. The second part of it is I worked for 6.5 years with at-risk youth and I was a carpentry tutor and we were getting young people that weren't going to school and we got them doing carpentry and we had a 95% success rate. Why? Because we told them they were useful. We were told them that New Zealand needed them, that they were valuable, that they had skills. That was the biggest thing we did for them. And most of them didn't even go building. They were carpet layers and car salesmen, but what we gave them was self-belief. And so what we believe is start trade training from year 9. So young people that don't fit in the school system can do trade training and actually be told they're useful for New Zealand. I was in Northland at the Northland Field Days up in Dargaville last year, and the guys wandering around, they had Dargaville trade training on their t-shirts. So I went up and said g'day and asked how they're getting on, and they said, oh, we're the dropouts. I said, what do you mean? Oh, we're the dummies. They say if you're a dummy and a dropout, you do the trades. I thought, man, that's so sad, because we actually want good tradespeople. We want toilets that flush, we want hot and cold water, we want our cars to start in the morning, we want a roof over our head. We actually want really high quality tradespeople. And to do that, we need to start putting value on them. So trade training at year 9 will reduce our prison population because young people involved in education are less likely to get involved in crime. That's all part of justice. We've got a policy around youth farms that's taking kids that are already in the justice system, so street kids, etc., taking them out of that situation for a whole year, putting them in a totally different environment where they learn horticulture, viviculture, animal husbandry, they grow their own vegetables, they look after their own room. But the biggest thing you're doing is you're separating them from that negative environment. You're cutting a line between the connection they've got with the gangs and with other street kids, and you're showing them something different. It won't work with all of them, but it will make a difference in some. And then the last part of our policy is 3-stage sentencing, and this is a bit around what you were saying about how to rehabilitate well. Totally agree, we've got to rehabilitate better. So our 3-stage sentencing, actually, what it does is it says to the offenders when they get to prison, the first thing you must do is you must engage in work in prison. Whether it's in the laundry or the kitchen or in the beehives, whatever, you must engage in work. So you can't just sit in your cell and do nothing, you must engage. The second part of it is every prisoner gets an independent education target to hit. Because a lot of our offenders are fetal alcohol syndrome, they're dyslexic, they have very poor numeracy and literacy. And so for some of them, it may just be getting basic numeracy and literacy up. For others, it might be a degree or a diploma. If they're really, really intelligent, they might get a trade. But the thing is, 2 things. One, we're giving them tools that they're going to need in the future, but the second thing, we're making them responsible for it. It is not someone else doing it for them. They must achieve that result. So it's made achievable, but they are responsible to get there. And when they do, the reward is open prison. So the reward is for them working outside of prison during the day, in prison at night. The advantages of that are they're rubbing shoulders with people that are incarcerated. So instead of spending 10 or 15 years simply with people that are also incarcerated and having no idea what it looks like outside, they're rubbing shoulders with the people that got touch rugby on Thursday night, with the family that are going fishing on the weekend or planning a holiday overseas. Stewart Island, I think it's about it at the moment. But anyway, but do you know what I mean? They're actually understanding what culture's like outside. That's aspirational, inspirational. And they're also getting work skills, because what they're doing then they can do when they get released. You could expand that. They have weekends off or weeks off. They get paid. That money goes to pay for their food and lodging, just like yours does. But what we're doing, in reality, if you look at it, if they choose not to engage, they're choosing not to come back into society. That is their choice. But what we're saying to offenders, we, the population, will do everything we can to help you. We will do everything we can to give you the tools necessary for you to succeed outside. But if you choose not to, you're not allowed to go out and make more victims. Because the government's role is to protect, enable and encourage. And we can't let people out that don't want to reform. So there you go, there's a justice system in 5 minutes.
So, Ben, you brought up the issue of housing. Please tell our people and viewers on this channel what the Opportunities Party policy is on housing.
All right. I'm guessing as a builder, you might have an opinion or two on housing.
Yeah, a bit opinionated probably. Ben's quite right in a lot of it. In regards to materials, it's just too expensive in New Zealand to get a new material approved, because we're such a small market, then people don't, and so we're stuck in a monopoly. So absolutely right, if materials are approved offshore, allow them in New Zealand, that's a good way to go. In regards to the RMA, the big thing with it, this needs to be transparent so we all know what you're doing. If the developer knows these are the rules, he can apply the rules, it goes through quickly. The RMA is so much of it is subjective. So someone says, oh, I don't think that applies this time, makes it too hard. So for the RMA and overhaul, it's actually just making it transparent so everyone knows what the rules are. We know what the rules are, apply them fairly, away we go. Pre-consenting plans would help with the process to make it easier. So plans that were pre-designed on the web and basically approved, and all you have to get approved later on is the siting and drainage for wherever the site is, and that would be much easier for builders to price them all online. That would be a quick, easy solution. I probably disagree a wee bit about whack up your own house, because what we have just found out that is if you have a healthier home, there's much less chance of those people going into a hospital or any medical care. Not so bad here, but down in Christchurch it's flipping cold. Our house is 100 years old and the toilet froze over in the back of it once, okay? It's cold. So I believe we need to build better quality houses, and the way we can do that is actually give the GST, you take the GST component off if you build a house that meets a certain criteria. That means you can build one, because I know I can build a low-energy house for about 15% more as a standard build. So in which case, if you give the GST back, then people get it for the same price, in which case we're saving money in the future. Because we can build houses that you don't have to spend much money putting heat into. They actually basically self-heat with you living in it, and put a proper ventilation system. So a better quality house for the same money as a standard house. There's people doing amazing work right through New Zealand right now. We bumped into this guy called Tiny in Rotorua, who is New Zealand's most efficient houser of the homeless. I don't know if you heard about him. He is awesome. And what he's doing is, he's putting a whole wraparound service around those people that are homeless. And that's where he's making the difference. So he's looking after them, he's got security there, he's keeping an eye on the motels where they are, and there are people investing with land and housing for them. So working with people that are making a difference, like this guy Billy, is huge. I agree with Sue, the mixed ownership model would work really well. So what that does is, if you're a first-time buyer, actually 40% of it is owned by the government and you own 60%, and as time goes on, your equity goes on, you buy out the government on your house. So it's a shared model. The government is helping you get in your own home, because what happens is, if you own your own home, you're more stable for your family, you have better health outcomes, better societal outcomes for if we get people own their own home. And one part of that we stand for is actually net zero immigration for a time until New Zealand's housing crisis is sorted.
Yeah.
Because as long as people are coming in, that's more houses we need. And if we haven't got enough houses now and demand increases, price goes up. It's very, very basic economics. So actually net zero immigration until we've got our housing sorted out, and then we can actually move forward at a safer rate. So there's a whole lot of good things. I agree with a lot of what you said, and I think the beautiful thing is, this is just common sense New Zealanders bringing out things that will work.
Okay, we've probably going to move into something that's probably a little bit more partisan, the issue of abortion. So in March this year, just as we went into lockup, the government passed through what many considered probably the most harshest abortion laws, or most liberal abortion laws in the entire world. What's been hailed by many as being the most liberal laws in the world, allowing for full-term abortion and even allowing a child to die on the gurney if it happens to be born alive. I guess the question that I would have is, what is each of your party's view on this liberalisation of the abortion laws, and would you seek, if you were in power or had in position of influence, to change those laws or to revoke that legislation, would you do so, and to what extent? I'll start with Leighton.
Thank you. Hey, look, as a party, we've said we're totally against the abortion law, and there's a few reasons for it. One, it was totally undemocratic the way they did it, pushing it through while we were in lockdown. There was no need for that to happen. They didn't discuss it with people. In fact, they excluded 95% of submitters from talking to the select committee. So it was undemocratic and unjust. But the biggest thing is, it took the human rights off the most vulnerable in New Zealand. And I can't see how a government, especially one that's loving and kind, can take the human rights off one group of New Zealanders. The government has just come out now and said they want extra support for people that have stillbirths or miscarriages. So they're recognising the value of life, they're recognising the harm of this death, but then they've also said you can terminate up to full time. They've said they don't want it for sex selection. One of the articles in the law says that the government does not agree with using abortion for sex selection, but it's not illegal. So we are going to see it used for sex selection. We're going to see it used for terminating the disabled, like I mentioned earlier. That is not how we look after New Zealanders. So I'm against the law. We're saying we won't actually go, we would like to go into Parliament with the revocation of that law and go back to the people of New Zealand to decide what New Zealand looks after. Look, what New Zealand looks like going forward, because it's our nation and we should choose. And for a small group of people to force their ideology through while they locked us up, that is not democratic, and that's not the New Zealand that we deserve.
Yeah.
From abortion to another controversial topic, gender ideology and sex education, particularly that in schools. We've seen the one view, a middle view, and the opposing view.
So look, as an adult, if you make a choice, it's your choice. If you're going to chop something off or glue something off, that's up to you. But we should not be sexualising our children. 90% of young people that suffer with gender dysphoria, by the time they finish puberty, are quite happy with how they were born. So by allowing them to make decisions that will affect them for the rest of their lives before they finish puberty is actually wrong. And what we're doing in schools at the moment, with as young to 5-year-olds, is teaching kids that they are male or female, they can choose. That is actually wrong. We shouldn't be sexualising children. Let them be kids. Let them go, kick a ball around, climb a tree, play with dolls, whatever they feel like doing. Let them be children. We should not be sexualising children. And if you go to the school libraries, and you go to the public library, and you read the books that they're putting in front of our children, they're sexualising them. Just let them be kids, for crying out loud. And most of them will be quite happy with how they were born by the time they finish puberty, but those that don't, as adults, they get to choose. I don't think actually we should be publicly funding sex change operations. I believe that if you choose you want that, it's up to you to fund it. I don't think it's a priority for us. We've got people suffering terminal illnesses we can use that money for, rather than just on cosmetic surgery or gender choice. That's what we stand for.
Okay, moving on to gun laws. So, following March 2019, the Labour government initiated a gun buyback scheme, which affected many New Zealanders. And what is the views of your party on the gun laws, current gun laws?
Okay, I can go first.
You go first.
Again, this is government overstepping the mark, isn't it? They didn't listen to the people, they ignored them, they rushed through law within a couple of weeks because of one ratbag. Okay, and what he did was totally wrong, but they had no right to change all the laws without actually talking to us about it. They took private property rights off New Zealanders, law-abiding New Zealanders. They wasted hundreds of millions of dollars and tens of thousands of police hours for no gain, because they actually didn't do the proper process. Could have got the same result with no cost to the taxpayer if they actually listened, but they refused to listen. So it's a very, very poor law. It shouldn't be rushed through, it should be revoked, and we should have the conversation as New Zealanders rather than actually what they've done. And the trouble with it is the waste of time and asset that allowed other crime to grow, because policemen weren't doing their core role. They were actually going back to the gun, having to enforce people handing their property rights. And this is extended. The latest one is actually the tenancy laws. The tenancy laws are taking your private property rights off your house off you and putting it in the hands of the tenants. That is not right. That is not right. No landlord wants to get rid of good tenants. Landlords love good tenants. But the only tenants they want to get rid of are the ones that are destroying their property and not paying it. This law makes it virtually impossible, incredibly difficult for landlords to do it. So rental prices will go up because of this law. And it's the same thing. Government rushing through law without talking to the people is poor law. This is very, very poor law. We're saying provoke it and allow the people of New Zealand to have a cool. It hasn't reduced gun violence. It hasn't had any positive effect on us as a nation. It basically meant a whole lot of law-abiding citizens felt like criminals.